All right, well, first things first, we decided we were scouring the planet to find 3 experts of their field. Scouring. And we combed and we spent weeks and weeks and weeks. And it's just, we looked through just, the entire East Side. And it turns out the 3 biggest experts are actually right here in our church when it comes to integrating your faith with your work. And we have some questions for them, and we're going to dialogue a little bit. So I want to welcome Crystal Riccardi, Patrick Lowndes, and our very own Brian Martin. So if you know a little bit about each of these folks, they do things a little different. Their worlds overlap a little bit, but they have very different expertises, and they do very different things in the marketplace. So Patrick, well, since you're sitting down first, man, why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and where you work?
So I am, what's a good way to answer this question? I do software stuff. I do entrepreneur stuff. Sometimes those worlds collide, and sometimes they don't. And I also really like helping entrepreneurs that are in other parts of the world where the gospel's not. That's a huge, huge calling of my life. So, yeah, software and entrepreneur.
You got it.
I'm Crystal, and I'm an occupational therapist. I'm also a functional nutritionist, and I get to coach at a CrossFit type gym a couple days a week. So, yeah.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
I'm Brian. I'm an engineering lead at Microsoft on the Windows AI platform team.
You're a software engineer at Microsoft? Yeah. For us that don't know any of that stuff. So I got to spend some time with these folks this week and sort of brainstorming some questions around what might be helpful for all of you. And we came up with a lot of good stuff. And naturally, as we talk about faith and work, the sort of first question that typically comes up is, honestly, evangelism. Like, how do I do that? And so sometimes being a Christian in the workplace can feel a little weird. And sometimes you can kind of just be a little weird when you're talking. And so the question I have for you guys is, how do you talk about your faith in Jesus sort of in a normal way that's inviting and not maybe too religious?
Yeah, I can start. This kind of clicked for me a few years ago when I realized that I was not talking about Jesus the way that I talk about my family or other experiences. And it was like a switch. I was just talk about Jesus and going to church the way I would talk about any other event that I did. So when someone says, what did you do this week? What are you looking forward to this weekend? I say I'm going to be with my church friends, family. We have this thing called Mission to Communities where we share a meal. And it just opens the door to a normal conversation about my life. So instead of contrast that with, I don't start with taking a political stance on what's happening and I bring that up in the lunchroom. Instead, it's just my story and talk about things that are happening in my life that's not very controversial. It's just what I did this weekend.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely think the Lord uses story tremendously in my life, too, of just sharing my story so that it's not, and also listening to other people's stories. Sometimes we have a hard time listening and just hearing people and hearing, people just want to be known and heard and seen. And so sharing parts of your story, even that are difficult, really draw people in to understand that you don't have it all together. And you also have a deep desire to learn their story and to know who they are as a person. Also, just to recognize that you get to be a part of what God is already doing, and it's not all in your hands. That, right. Oh, I've got to save this person. I've got to tell them about Jesus so that they can come to Jesus. More, it can take that weight off of you, just knowing that you get to be a part of what God's doing and to join in his work to draw people towards him. And that's exciting. I think it's a privilege and an honor, and so I get really excited. And the last thing is just knowing that it's such a process. Right. It's about relationship. It's not about this point in time where you kind of have to close the deal, I'm going to tell them about Jesus, and then they're going to come to Jesus. But to know that you're in this for the long haul, and if you work with these people too, you're going to see them day to day. You spend so much time at work, and you get to be a part of that process and know that all that pressure isn't on that one interaction that you have with them, but that you're, in relationship with them. So.
And a good example to think about that is dots versus lines. Sometimes we think like, oh, there's going to be this dot, this moment, right? And this is my one shot. But really, people in relationships, our friends, they're usually built over that period of time, and they're looking for the trend line of does Crystal care for me? Does she ask about how things are going in my life? Right? There's this trend that generally when I interact with Crystal or with Brian, I'm feeling something that's different from when I interact in other relationships. And so I love that thought of just this continuity, and that totally relieves pressure. And so for me, one of the things is I also like to, there's a big trend in our work culture, which is all about bringing your whole self to work. 10, 15 years ago, when I was first getting into the software space, that was not quite as prominent of a theme as it is today. But we all have this kind of macro level, tailwind behind us that helps us to say, look, part of bringing me to work is this, and then there's a right way to do that. Just being genuine. Genuineness is something that a lot of people value, and if you play into, hey, this is who I am, but then the reciprocity side is, tell me like what gets you excited, and not just being one-sided, but this is who I am. Like what really keeps you up? What drives you?
That's good.
Because all of a sudden you're like taking this interest in loving people.
Right. Yeah. No, that's. I mean, everything you guys said, spot on the money. I think one of the big things that for all of us to be considering, I think a lot of things in the back of people's minds is, well, the political, social, the ideological climate we all sort of live in now. And particularly being on the east side here, sharing your faith or you're sharing your story, ultimately those conversations are leading to a faith conversation down the road. Maybe it's years, maybe it's months, it's weeks, whatever. How do you, in that climate, avoid being chastised, ostracized, or even fired for your faith?
Yeah, I think that when we were talking about this on our pre-call, there's some of in leadership positions, there's certainly a challenge of you have a different way you're going to carry this when you have a team and people reporting to you. But for especially peers or more of a casual environment, there's really, I think it's really the enemy plants it in your mind that you are going to be immediately labeled or written off if you mention that you go to church. You mention anything about I was talking with God about this challenge I was dealing with, and I got a breakthrough. And we have this sort of impression that we're going to get labeled. And really, a lot of people are more, especially in this region, they're open. There really are a lot more open to spirituality. They're open to like, hey, is it okay if I pray for you about that tough situation? That just sounds really hard. Most people are going to be like, yeah, I appreciate you caring for me,
Right.
Yeah. And finding that person of favor is huge. You may be that person of favor, but also just finding that person of favor in your workplace. And you can't go at this alone. And I always try to just kind of hear people's stories, see where they're coming from, and really look for that support of drawing other Christians in, people that, have a desire to see people in the workplace come to Jesus and to know that you don't have to do this alone. And to be that person of favor is to kind of go above and beyond. And in healthcare, it's really, hear people's lives and their stories, but do more than just meet with them and then, check it off your list that appointment's over, but to really go above and beyond and care for people and connect them in ways that other providers wouldn't. So that's kind of how I see my role too, of just going above and beyond. So
love that.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I think building on what Crystal said, the interactions where you might have to have disagreement is probably not the first conversation, right? So there should be months, years of me caring for these people and showing them that I care for them before we ever have a conversation that might be a little bit difficult. And so I obviously have a lot of coworkers who disagree with me on a variety of issues. But what they won't be able to say is that Brian doesn't love me and care about me, because I've built that trust already. I've built that through how I care for them, how I check in on them, and how I've shown that I'm interested in their life outside of work, and remember their kids' names and spouses' names. And I think I like what Patrick said too. This is being a manager at Microsoft. A lot of our language now is around model, coach, and care, the behaviors that we want to see in our employees. And this is straight up discipleship language. And so part of my job is to care for the people reporting to me. And that makes it so easy for me, at least, to have built that trust before we have that potentially difficult conversation.
So you're saying you don't grab your easel and your end times chart and then walk right in the front of Microsoft with your bell and hear ye, the end is near?
Part of our new employee orientation, yeah.
Employee orientation. That's awesome. So I'm hearing, hey, it's not as, people are more receptive than you think. Right, people are more receptive than you think. You're sharing story and you're building relationship over time and getting to know people, knowing and so they're who's going to report you if you spent weeks and months and you've invested in time and you've earned that equity, that relational equity and that work equity to be able to talk to somebody. You've earned that over time, and so you're less likely to probably face some of those things that whether you go kick in the front door with your bell, probably not going to work out for you. Yeah. Let's pivot a little bit. We talk a lot about evangelism here, but there's another side to this. And so the question, I guess, for you guys is, how are you viewing your work, if you are at all, as an act of worship to God in and of itself?
I think a concept that really sticks out to me is, I just learned this about 2 years ago, but there's this word, Hebrew word called avodah. And it's used a lot in the Old Testament, but it's translated 3 different ways. It's the same word. It's translated work, service, and worship. So what's crazy about that word is that it implies, like, when you're working, in the Hebrew mindset, working is actually very similar and synonymous with worshiping in the temple. Like, there's actually a mental, this is all part of the same thing. And when I learned that, I'm like, gosh, I wish someone would have told me that a lot earlier in my career. Because then when I go in and I'm selling software, I'm building something, I can be viewing that as an act of worship. And we might have heard that like, oh, that's a trendy thing. My worship's everywhere. But it actually is how, for thousands of years, people have viewed working with God. So for me, I definitely do not nail it every time or even half the time some weeks. But I try, like, Lord, what does that look like to worship you in this? And not only excellent work, but when I fail, what happens, right? And sometimes that's actually your best chance to put the gospel on display, is when you need grace, when you need to actually humble yourself. And others will say more about that, I'm sure, because there's some good examples. But I think that's just how it shows up for me, is working excellently, but also just receiving the grace that I need when I fail.
It's good.
Oh, avodah, A-V-O, avo, and then da, D-A-H, avodah, if you want to check it out.
You guys have any Hebrew words to share?
No.
That's the only one that I've got, by the way. I don't have any others.
I'm lacking in that area. I definitely think that we're all gifted in certain ways. And so just using our gifts and our time and our talent is huge. God has gifted me in certain ways to really be attentive to people's needs and care for them in a deep way. And so I feel like I'm blessed that I get to go to work and get to use those gifts in my day-to-day. So I want to be able to use those gifts in that way that God has gifted me. And so I really feel like that's worship. And I'm thankful that those coincide and those, really just jive with each other. So it's kind of nice to go to work. I love it. And I feel like that's how I'm worshiping God and taking every opportunity to point to Jesus and our Creator of how amazing we're made, our bodies, and how He's provided good food. There's all these different examples of how God has created some amazing things for us and the way that He's created our bodies too. And so that gives me excitement. I get excited to tell my patients that, God is an amazing creator, and get to share that. So
it's going to sound like a stretch, but it's true. And I challenge you to do this with your own work. Connecting the dots with what you do to God's command for us to subdue the earth and be fruitful, multiply. I remember a few years ago, a while ago, I was working on Excel security bugs, and I was looking at this list of just thousands of bugs, and I'm like month 3 of working on just security bugs. And it occurred to me, this is the fall. There are people who are trying to corrupt Excel to steal your data, and how much more would there be of human flourishing if this entire team of developers was actually building features instead of trying to stop people from stealing your data? And it sounds silly, but it clicked for me. No, this is actually bringing the reconciliation and redemption to Excel, to other people. By fixing security bugs, I'm unlocking creativity for other people so that they can use spreadsheets to actually do what they were supposed to do and not worry that you're going to like lose all your financial information.
Preach.
Dude, that's gospel for engineers right there, dude.
Do I have some accountants in the room?
There's
Can I get an
some
amen?
amens went back there. Hey, get your hands up, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, and then I got another real quick one
Go ahead.
on the AI platform team. I actually got to work with GE Healthcare on one of their AI models building assistance for fetal ultrasounds, which was part of our story for a long time. Some of you know that, and so that was just a super straight line for me of I am unlocking this scenario so that healthcare gets better for people who don't have access to it, and just being able to draw that straight line from what I'm doing to making healthcare better, which is a way of honoring God and trying to make it more accessible to more people, was just a really powerful moment for me.
Love that. Hey, before you guys go, in 1 or 2 sentences, maybe 10 seconds, what is 1 or 2 things somebody can do this week that would help them sort of combine and merge this idea of faith and work?
I would say learn your coworkers' names, their first names. If some people don't know in a bigger company, their spouse's names or partner, and even their kids, or if they have pets. So that's just a way to practically connect with people and show that you give a rip, and it's because of Jesus.
That's right. Amen.
Yeah, listen, take notes when people tell you information and details. Like, take notes if you have to, whether it's mentally or just physically writing those things down, and then go back to them and ask them questions about those things. And then pray on the way to work. Just give that to the Lord and say, I'm entering into this workplace. God, what are you going to do today? And how are you going to use me? Help me to be attentive to your spirit and to your voice, to know when do I speak and when do I listen.
Amen.
It's one of my favorite things to do to create awkward conversations at work is to apologize, which nobody does. And I think when you make mistakes, our tendency, and it's actually reinforced, is to just go straight to the solution. How are you going to make it right? How are you going to fix it? But to spend a second, 10 seconds to say, hey, I really missed this. I messed up. I dropped the ball on this. I overlooked you, whatever it was that you did. I remember a couple years ago, I made an inappropriate joke at work, and I had to in open space. So I paused and got the attention of the people around me. I was like, hey, that was totally inappropriate. I'm really sorry for doing that. I was valuing what you thought of me and trying to be funny instead of caring what you all thought is appropriate workplace conversation. And it was just silence. No one knows what to do when you apologize, which is kind of fun.
Good word. Hey, will you thank our panel for sharing with us? Thank you, guys.